everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Philippe Lemoine, one of our research fellows, and he's the author of a new paper. We're going to talk about a new blog post called Lockdowns, Econometrics, and the Art of Putting Lipstick on a Pig. Philippe, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. How about you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Thanks for writing this. I mean, you've done it again. I think your last blog on Flaxman was just a work of art. It was really beautiful. We talked about it on the podcast before, and this one is similar. So, can you just tell us what is this paper that you're responding to in the broadest terms? What does it do, and what do you do in response?
Yes. So, roughly, this is a paper written by three economists. I mean, actually, econometricians. Statisticians they're kind of like a mix of statisticians and economists, and they've written this paper where they try to evaluate the effect of various non-pharmaceutical interventions during the first wave in the U.S. So, by the non-pharmaceutical intervention in questions, they're mandating face masks for employees in public-facing businesses, closing K-12 schools, closing non-essential businesses, and issuing a stay-at-home order. And so what they did is that they use pretty sophisticated econometrics tools, so the kind of statistical techniques that economists use to study the effect of various policies or various events, etc. And they've tried to use this to evaluate the effect that those policies had during the first wave of the pandemic in the US. And so what's interesting about this paper, the reason I chose this paper and I looked into this paper is that it's actually much more sophisticated and careful than the average study on the effect of non-pharmaceutical interventions during the pandemic. So like most studies don't really pay attention to the fact or try to control for the fact that people voluntarily change behavior even in the absence of government interventions, and so this can usually bias their conclusions and all sorts of other difficulties. And this paper is unusually careful in that respect because they start from a realistic causal model, and the entire model is motivated by this causal model. So they think carefully about what's the causal structure of the pandemic and how interventions affect it, but how the pandemic itself affects what interventions are put in
So this
place.
is important. It's not you're not strawmanning. You're not picking on a paper because it's unusually weak.
Yeah, exactly. It's the
You thought is
opposite.
the best, or one of the best econometric analyses, statistical analyses of what do non-pharmaceutical interventions, lockdowns, etc., how well they prevent the spread of coronavirus and how many lives they saved. Right. So what does the typical paper do? The typical paper just looks at an intervention. It tracks the date. It sees what happens afterwards, and it doesn't take into account any aspect of human behavior. Is that right? Or what people are going
Yeah.
to
I
do
mean,
voluntarily
you
are the source of
basically
that.
have you basically have two kinds of paper. You have on the one hand, you have the kind of paper that epidemiologists write, and what they do typically, that they make extremely strong mechanistic assumptions about how the epidemic works, basically. And so they make ridiculous assumptions like the
Yeah.
only thing that affects transmission is government interventions. And so they completely disregard voluntary behavioral changes that people engage in response to changes in epidemic conditions. So basically, when people start dropping dead around them, they're not going to go out as often. They're going to get scared, so they won't be seeing their friends as much as they used to, etc., etc. And the typical epidemiological papers during this pandemic has completely ignored this, or almost completely ignored this. And then you have also people who use the more traditional econometrics approach, where in that case they don't really make strong assumptions about the underlying causal processes. They don't pretend to. It's pretty agnostic. Those models are pretty agnostic about the underlying processes at work that generates the epidemic. What they do is that it's basically they look at correlation. It's like what you said. They look at the dates at which such and such interventions were in place, and they look at whether there is a correlation between this intervention being in place and the epidemic growing more slowly than it does when the intervention is not in place, and then they infer causation from this correlation. But the problem is that if I'm right, and I'm right, there is like a lot of evidence that shows this without any possible doubt, that people adjust their behavior voluntarily when the epidemic starts going badly. Then if you do this, the risk is that you're going to conclude that government interventions have reduced transmission a lot, for instance, because when governments typically enact this type of policies, it's when things go bad. But when things go bad, it's also typically when ordinary citizens change their behavior in a way that reduces transmission. So you're going to attribute a lot of the effect that is really due to people voluntarily changing their behavior to the government intervention that may not be doing much on its own. Or, there's also another possibility, which is that precisely because governments tend to enact this type of policy when things going badly, it means that when they do enact it, often, it could be that the epidemic is growing very fast. And so you might be inferring that the interventions actually made things worse but when really it's not the case. What happened is just that there is what economists call an endogeneity problem, which is that when governments have tended to enact those policies when things were going badly. So of course, if you do a correlation, you might find that typically enacting this type of interventions is correlated with the epidemic growing stronger. If you interpret that causally, you're going to infer that the interventions actually made things worse, when in fact that's not the case. It's just this problem that it's difficult to infer causation from correlational data. And so for various reasons, I don't really believe this second possibility is a big worry. I think the first one is much more concerning in practice. But both are theoretical possibilities, and you have to. Most studies just simply don't really care about that sort of things.
Yeah, and so this guy Viktor Chernoshkov is the the main author. He's a statistician at MIT. So he's more sophisticated than most people. His paper and with his co-authors got something like 200 something citations. And so this is the cutting edge. What does he do differently? How does he overcome these problems and these other
So I should say he's not alone. He has two co-authors. One is called Paul Shrimps. I know because I've talked with him. I forgot the name. I apologize to the third one. I forgot his name. But there's a third person who was involved. And so clearly they're all like very sophisticated economists and econometricians. And what they do differently is that, first of all, before they started before they put together a model to estimate the impact of government interventions, they just paused for a second, and if they thought, okay, what's the let's figure out let's think about what could be the causal process here. And what they do is that they say, okay, if you think about it, it's not just government interventions. We expect them to have some effect on transmission, but we also expect people to voluntarily change their behavior, and we expect that this is also going to have an effect on transmission. But moreover, we expect, basically you have, what they put together is a causal schema where, okay, you have the epidemic itself. The epidemic itself, changing the growth of the epidemic is going to cause different things. It's going to cause people to change their behavior, which in turn is going to affect the epidemics by making it grow more slowly. But it's also going to cause governments to enact interventions in the hope that it will make the epidemic grow more slowly, or even recede. And those interventions, we expect them to have some effect on transmission. And so you have this complex causal processes. And what they do is that one nice thing about their paper, and they start by carefully thinking this through, the different ways in which the different variables can affect each other and affect the outcome. And once they've done that, they put together a system of equations which under some circumstances, which hopefully are met, although as you're aware and even say in the paper, we have no way to know for sure, um, will allow you to recover causal effects for each of those variables, taking into account the other. So you're going to get, if things go right, you're going to get the actual causal effect of the government interventions, without, attributing some of what's really the effect of people's voluntary change of behavior to the intervention. Or you're going to get the real causal effect of intervention. You're going to get the real causal effect of people's voluntary change in behavior, etc. And so, you won't make the same mistakes that many other studies do, and attribute part of the effect of voluntary changes in behavior to government interventions, or the epidemic going bad causing governments to enact some policies, and then you're going to be like, oh, falsely conclude that the interventions made things worse. So they're basically what they did that was better than the other papers is most other papers, the vast majority of other papers, is that they thought carefully about the complex causal relations between the different variables at play here, and then once they've done that, they've used standard econometrics techniques to sort this out, to be able to isolate the causal effects of these different variables. And of course, it's still very difficult. It still relies on many assumptions, and something I discussed in the paper. We never know for sure if they're right. In some cases, we have very good reasons to think they're not right. They're not.
Yeah, let's talk about what are some of the assumptions. So, what kind of degrees of freedom does the researcher have in a case like this? It's
So
probably
you have to make a
example.
lot of choices. I mean, at the very basic level, for instance, they have to. You don't expect the epidemic. Other things being equal, you don't expect the epidemic to grow as fast everywhere, right? For instance, this has been observed. Even before there was any policy enacted, before people started changing their behavior, etc. You can see that the what epidemiologists call the basic reproduction number, which roughly measures on average how many people a person who is infected is going to go on to infect in turn at the beginning of the epidemic. It wasn't the same everywhere. There was some pretty huge differences in the U.S. There was some really huge difference between counties, for instance, and even between states. So one thing they have to do is say, okay, you can't assume that other things being equal, um, the epidemic is going to grow as fast everywhere. So you have to take that into account, because if your model implicitly makes this assumption, it's going to be bad. So you have to include some confounders in your model, some variables, control for a variety of things, in the hope that it will capture those differences between places that are totally independent from interventions, or I mean, they may interact with them, but hopefully they don't. Um, and independent of people's behavior, etc. So for instance, there's an easy case where you're gonna want to control for population density, because we expect that in denser areas, the virus is going to be able to spread faster than in sparsely populated areas, right? But the problem is that you have to make they control for this, they control for unemployment. The problem is that we don't really understand. I mean, we know that population density affects the spread of the virus, but even that is often not the correlation is often not impressive. In one of my previous reports for CSPI, my case against lockdown, I looked at the correlation between population density in Europe and the number of deaths per capita, and there was none. So it's sometimes you're a bit surprised, but we expect that that's just because there has to be some confounding factors here. We expect that density is going to affect transmission, but there are a lot. We're sure there has to be a lot of other factors, and mostly we don't know what they are. So they have to make a choice about what kind of variables they're going to control for. So they use unemployment, the poverty rates. Okay, there are various things you can.
Well, look, just going back to density, you don't know, for example, whether it's linear, right? If there's a linear relationship between density and the reproduction rate, right? You don't know like whether different kinds of density matter, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you have like you might have a place where even within one community or county or state or whatever you're measuring, there's so much variation, right? There might be there could be a state with low population density because there's a lot of rural areas, and then there's like a few areas where everyone's packed together, and then you can compare that to like a state or a county or whatever where it's more of an even distribution, right? And so this is just one variable. This is just one variable, and you have no idea the effect of the variable on the outcome of interest, right? And this is just one
Yeah.
of them, right? And
Yeah,
so you can
I
do
mean,
this with
even
each
if
of
there
them.
weren't all those difficulties with this particular variable, nobody doubts. There's absolutely no doubt that this is very far. This one variable is very far from explaining the entire difference, between different places, and so there are other factors, and you have to make a choice about which one you're going to control for, but you don't really know. Uh, you don't really know which one you should. So they make some sensible choices. I mean, like it makes sense to include the poverty rate, for instance, because you expect if there are more poor people, they tend to live like to be more numerous in their apartments or houses, and so this facilitates transmission. Okay, but there are like dozens of things you could include, and they can, for various reasons. You also don't want to put everything you possibly can because then it creates statistical difficulties. So they have to make a choice, but really they have very little to go on, on what they can base those choices. I mean, there are a few like obvious things like density, but beyond that, there are still like a lot of once you have included densities, there's still a lot that remains to be explained, and we don't really know. So that's just one example of like the kind of choices assumptions you have to, and so the model like uh, implicitly assumes that those confounders that they included in the model, they're enough to explain the entire difference between different places. Between how fast the epidemic is how fast the epidemic is growing, other things being equal, and they know it's not true. They know that.
Yeah, and
Uh,
and and and, the, and it's only state level, right? It's the
yeah,
state.
it's at the state level.
Yes,
Yeah.
if what's funny things about American state level. If you just look at state level analysis, you'd think there would be a positive correlation between black population and voting Republican, because
Yeah.
the states with the most black people tend to vote the most Republican, right? And so you could see the problem here. You're
Yeah,
dealing with
yeah.
this
So
because it's a
you have
very
a you
is
have
a
it on.
very crude
They have
measure.
another paper forthcoming, but like the code and everything, it hasn't been published, accepted for publication yet, and we don't have the code and everything. But what they do, I mean, they look at less policies, etc. But they do look at they do use county level data, so we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, this one is like at the state level, and you're right. This creates another uh, complication, because you can have this sort of like what statisticians call ecological correlation. They can be misleading, and the example you gave is a great one. Like if you look at the percentage of black population, you may conclude that black people really vote for the Republican Party a lot, but we know it's the opposite. They're like 90% 10 for the Democratic Party at presidential election. So um, but it's just that's just like a tiny. There are many other assumptions they make that I discussed, in the
Yeah,
paper. Some are a
you
bit.
are very kind to them. It's like they have a building, and all you need to find is like one flaw in the building for the whole thing to collapse. And you like you in this report, you just go through it, and you find 1,000, but if not problems, at least potential problems, right? You
Yeah,
would
yeah.
not. I
Well, I
just
mean,
want to
I
tell
I
you
think
would.
some of them are definitely not potential, but
Yeah, yeah. Oh
but
yeah. We'll get to this. Yeah, if this was
yeah,
a building, you would
we'll
not
get to
fit
this.
in.
But when we're talking about the model, look, um, when I said that they know that, for instance, those confounders, they don't explain all of the differences, other things being equal between places. Yeah, sure, they know it, but the hope, and this is never the case. You never get a model that's going to be where the assumptions are exactly true. That's normal. There's nothing wrong with this. But you're hoping, the hope is that it will get close enough to the truth that your estimates will be okay. They will be
Right.
fairly accurate. And my point is that the problem is that because we don't understand the dynamic of the epidemic well enough, in this case, we really we don't have enough like subject matter specific knowledge to be at all confident that this is the case. So this is different from your from many other cases where uh, we have a fairly good understanding of the subject matter of the underlying subject matter. So we know that our model is not the assumptions are not exactly true. That the confounders we included in the model they don't control for everything, but because we have a good understanding of the underlying subject matter, we can be fairly confident that it's close enough to the truth. Now, the problem here is that because we don't have a good enough understanding of the subject matter, because if we did, we wouldn't be so puzzled by so many things about the pandemics. Why waves come and go when they do? How come, like, Japan is doing so relatively well when, it seems that they're doing nothing compared to most Western countries? We're puzzled by so many things. And so clearly we don't have a good understanding of the subject matter. And when you don't have a good understanding of the underlying subject matter, you have no reason to be confident that uh, the confounders, for instance, that you included in your model, they're actually good enough. And so that's a problem. This is through no fault of the authors, because they can't be expected to solve the get us a good understanding of the underlying subject matter, that the dynamic of epidemics, which is something that we clearly don't understand very well, in my opinion. But it's still a fact, that it's still a fact that, and I'm pretty sure this they would admit this, and in fact, in the paper, they do say that, of course, the hope is that this this framework that they adopted allows them to recover causal effect, and in the right circumstances, it does allow to recover causal effects. But they do also note that we can't guarantee that those circumstances actually obtain, and we have. My point is, given how little we know about the underlying subject matter and some other things that I discussed in the paper, we have we have no good reason to be very confident that the model is actually good enough, for their purposes. But
Yeah,
that's the best you can do.
yeah, but you don't let. I mean, I wouldn't let them completely off the hook because they couldn't have done it better. But then maybe you shouldn't do it, right? Just because you can measure population density and percentage and percentage and poverty and these other things, and you don't know that those are the important the important variables, all of them. The answer, I think, to that is not to do the analysis, right? It's not. It's at least, or at least not to do it this way, right? Because you do it, you give the false idea. People take this stuff as, people are amazed by statistics and charts and graphs and numbers and credentials, right? So this MIT statistician comes out, he's got these models, he's got these beautiful graphs, he's got these equations that, 99.9% of people can't understand, right? And people are going to take that seriously, and people are going to adjust their ideas about the pandemic, and eventually policy is going to be influenced. And if it's as terrible as you say, and I think it is, this methodology is that bad, then you have an obligation not to do this stuff and not to put it out there into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with this. I mean, and I do criticize the main author for a statement he made in the press about this study, which I think is extremely misleading, and maybe we'll get to this later. But on the other hand, I understand that those people, they have a career. It's kind of a game, like they're part of this game, and this is how it works. And I agree. My goal, one of my goals, when I write this sort of things, is to show to people, to explain to them why this is bad and why you can't really trust this sort of things. So my view, I completely agree. If you want my view about what researchers should do, yeah, mostly I think they should abstain from doing this sort of analysis on the thing. One thing I argued on my in my case against lockdowns is that I don't really think that it's even possible, given the kind of data we have and the kind of understanding of the underlying subject matter we have, that it's possible to accurately estimate the effect of government interventions on the epidemic, precisely using all those complicated models, etc. I think the best we can do is use some very rough, very simple graph, basically eyeball a few graph. And I think when you do this, you can reach the conclusion that, I have no idea what the exact effect of government interventions is, but whatever the precise effect, it can be huge, and that's about it. And I think that if you try to go beyond this, you're just basically going to fool people or fool yourself often. Uh,
Yeah.
but
And so
because you're going to give people, it's like you were saying, you're going to give people the illusion that you have some kind of like special insight and like scientifically reliable way of figuring out what the effect of those interventions are, when really you don't, because the truth is that all of your estimates, uh, their truth, their accuracy depends on many assumptions that we not only have no way of verifying, but also often have very good reasons to think are false, or in some cases, know for a fact without any possible doubt are false.
Yeah, yeah, that's I mean that's all yeah, very important, but the we should say that it's there there are some, I think we haven't even gotten to the real fatal flaws in the
Yeah,
paper.
yeah.
Yeah, the ignored variable, and then the fact that when you change around a few assumptions you can get different results. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So what we've discussed just now, it's just run of the mill. You do this kind of statistical work. This is you can never be sure that your model is quite right, etc. This is always the case. I think in this case it's much worse because again we really don't have a good enough understanding of the underlying subject matter to be at all confident that it's at least good enough. Uh, but this still, in a way, this is still just run of the mill difficulties that you have with that sort of work. And in fact, as I said, also in many ways, this paper is unusually sophisticated and much better than the rest of the literature on this topic. But then, if you look at the details, so what they do, we should probably describe their findings a little bit before I discuss, what comes next.
Sure.
What they find is that those policies, those non-pharmaceutical interventions, so again, stuff like mandating face masks for employees in public-facing businesses, closing schools, closing non-essential businesses, stay-at-home orders. They find that they had a fairly large effect on the number of cases and the number of deaths. So, for instance, for their headline results is the result about masks, because that's the one which is the most robust in their analysis. The other results, especially the one about schools, they actually say themselves that they don't really trust it, because basically what happened is that in the U.S., all states closed schools within a week, within the same week, basically. So you had very little variation in the data, and all of those statistical techniques, in order to estimate the effect of policies, there needs to be some variations in the data. So if you don't have variation, you can't really do it. And so for schools, they say, okay, we don't really take seriously any of the conclusions of our model about schools because, the depending on the specification of the model, the conclusion of the model is like all over the place, and this is exactly what you would expect given the lack of variation in the data. But for the other policies, especially the one on the mass mandates, they find like really large effects. So for the mass mandate, for instance, they estimate that had all states um, mandated employees in public-facing businesses to wear masks on March 14th, uh, it would have saved between 11 and 45,000 people lives by the end of May. So that's like between 10 and 45%. Uh, that's between a 10 and a 45% reduction in mortality caused by the epidemic. So that's a
Mhm.
lot. It's all in. If you look at the highest uh, estimate, that's like almost half of the death could have been saved by doing that.
Mhm.
And I mean, I just want to say first, like before I get to the some of the nasty details, that I mean, who believes that? Who believes that uh, if you just because like if you had mandated uh, employees in public facing businesses, not everyone, just employees in public facing business. We'll go back to this later because this is going to be important.
Yeah.
Uh, you could have saved almost half. You could have reduced the number of deaths by almost half. I mean, come on, it's just like it doesn't pass a basic smell test, right? But so given that it doesn't pass a basic smell test, you start looking at the details. So that's what I did. The thing is, like I said, when you put together this kind of model, you have to make a lot of assumptions, and there are lots of choices that you make, and you can make equally reasonable or sometimes even more reasonable choices, and you might get different results. So my logic was like, okay, because in the paper they only look at a handful of specifications of the model. So a specification is just one version of the model that includes certain assumptions, whereas a different specification is another version of the model that is based on different
Yeah. So,
assumptions.
for example, like what variables you include, how many? I think one of them is how the lag between
Yeah,
the
yeah.
policy and when the test results come back, when you find out that there are more infections, and so
Yeah,
yeah,
that's just one example. And another example, so I said that they're taking into account the fact that people change their behavior in response to information about the epidemic. And so one decision you have to make when you put together this model is, okay, what information do we assume that people use to adjust their behavior? Do they use information on the number of cases in their states, or do they use the information on number of case at the national level, nationally, or do they use information about the number of deaths but not the number of cases, or do they use both? Do they use the information about the number of cases and the number of deaths? And if they do so, do they use information about the number of cases and deaths only at the state level or at the national level? And you have many different combinations, and we don't really know. I mean, who knows exactly what information people use to adjust their behavior. And as you could say, okay, let's just throw everything into the model, but that's not really a great solution because it causes statistical problems when you have too many things in your model. So uh, the bottom line is you have to make this kind of decision, and you don't really know what's the right model. Okay, what's the right specification? Should I assume that people only use information about cases in their state, or should I assume that they use both information on cases and death in their state and nationally? Say we don't know yet. We
yeah,
don't
and
really know.
even I mean, just to go back to something, the how they measure the policy within each state, there will be like differences within across counties in the state, right, or
Yeah,
across
yeah, yeah.
locales,
That's
and then
another
they will.
problem.
There's so much
Yeah,
here.
when do you decide that enough counties, I mean, in some cases there was a statewide policy that was enacted, but in some cases it was done on a county by county basis. How do you decide when exactly you must assume that the policy was in place in the whole state? Because again, you're using data at the state level. You can't go below this. So you have to make some assumptions about when the policy is in state and in place and when it's not in place. And so you have to make all sorts of semi-arbitrary decisions like this. And so you have really a lot of possible combinations of different specification of the model that are different, that may lead to different conclusions, but are equally reasonable. Because again, we don't know what the right model is. So my approach was like, okay, given that we don't know what the right model is, let's look at a fairly large range of reasonable, of plausible models. I don't know which one is the right one. Uh, I mean, in fact, I'm pretty sure there is not a single one that is a right. There is not a right one, but which is the best or which are the best. I don't know. So I'm looking at a fairly large range of possible specification of the model. I end up with something like 252 different specifications, and I don't think you can really rule out uh, any of those specification a priori. I mean, different people may make different judgment calls on this, and maybe some people are going to get like 300 specification instead of 250, or some people are going to get 200 or even 150. But I tried different combination. It didn't really affect the conclusion anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The point is, we don't know which is the right model, which models are best. So my approach is like, okay, let's look at all of the specification that's based on the little understanding we have of the underlying subject matter, seem more or less equally plausible. And let's see if the results of the analysis of the authors is affected a lot by which model we look at. And when you do this, you find that even that the effects, it does change a lot. So depending on which specification you use, you can get vastly different results. Like the the effect size can be extremely much larger and is going to be much larger in some specification than others. The effect is going to be statistically significant in some specifications, but not in others. It makes a lot of differences, a lot of difference. And so I do this systematically, much more systematically than they do in the paper, because in the paper, as in most papers, they just look at a handful of specification. Then later they have some sensitivity analysis where they do some fancy stuff, but you don't even need to do this fancy stuff. You can already show that the effects disappear or are vastly reduced or vastly increased depending on by making like relatively small tweaks to the most basic model they use. And so when I do this, I find that depending on what specification you use, the effect is all over the place. Sometimes it's going to be statistically significant, sometimes not. In fact, for if you look at the just by changing the specification of the model, it's very easy. There is not a single effect, not even the one on of the mass mandate, that is statistically significant in every case or almost every case. For instance, in the case of the mandate of mask, when I use the same version of the data set that they use for the paper, I find that even the effect of mask, which was the most robust in their analysis, it's still only significant in 78% of specifications, I think. So there's still like more than a fifth of specification in which the effect is not statistically significant. So that doesn't inspire great confidence, but it's about to get a lot worse.
Yeah, well, well, they do. I mean, what they do in these academic papers is funny because they say they do the sensitivity analysis. So, like you said, there's 250 of them, and so they'll present a main model, and they'll say there's a statistically significant effect, and then they have 200 more to choose from, right? And so they say, I have this sensitivity analysis. I did, A, B, C, D, and E, right? And there's still statistically significant results, but there's
Yeah, yeah.
220 more things, 250 more things you could have done, and then
Yeah,
you
I
exactly.
think it's a big problem in general. So this is like true in statistical research in general. Is that people don't do sensitivity analysis in a systematic enough fashion. Really, what you want to do is like you want to decide before you even look at the results. Okay, what specification can I rule out, and which one I can't rule out because I'm not in a position to say that this one is not actually better than another one that I was going to include initially. So and if you do this, I think if you do this, you're going to get a lot more specification than people usually do. But like they don't want to report. Usually you have a table and you have room for 4 specification, and of course they're going to tend to choose. They want to get published. They're going to tend to choose the specification that find a statistically significant effect. This leaves a lot of room for this kind of nonsense. It would be much better if people, if journals, I mean, it would be much better if there were no journals and no pre-publication peer review, but that's a story for another time. But if you're going to have journals, then they should insist on more systematic sensitivity analysis, and they should just have the sort of tables that I have in the blog post where I summarize, in what percentage of cases the effect is statistically significant in those 252 specification. What's the mean point estimate of the effect? What's the range of point estimates? So people can get a sense. The point is that what's the reason why I do that? I want to give a sense to people on how much the conclusion that you derive from your model depends on the specific assumptions you include in the model. You base the model on, and if your results are robust, it shouldn't change much. You can change the assumptions, etc., and it won't. The results are going to stay roughly the same. And if that's the case, then yes, you can be fairly confident. I mean, it depends on the situation, but in some cases, at least, if that's the case, you can be fairly confident that your conclusion is actually accurate. But if that's not the case, given that you have no way of discriminating between those specifications, then you shouldn't be confident in the conclusion of any of them. Maybe the effect is real and large. Okay, that's possible. I mean, it's the case in some of those specifications, but maybe there is no effect. In fact, maybe the effect is positive, as you find for some of them in some cases. So um, the point is, it's important to give a sense to people of how sensitive your conclusions are to semi-arbitrary assumptions that you make. Because if they're very sensitive to this and it actually changes qualitatively, not just quantitatively, your conclusions, then you shouldn't be going out and talking to journalists and telling them that, oh yeah, you have totally shown that such and such a policy had such and such an effect. You haven't shown this, if this is the case. And this is the case here, in this case.
Yeah, I mean, you have this beautiful table that shows different specifications for different variables. The percent, the percent of the time that it's significant, depending on how many models, different models you use, and sometimes they're significant in a positive direction. So the whatever the intervention is will actually make cases increase, right? I mean,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's really all over the place. And of course, you're not gonna run with those models if you're an academic. But let's get to the worst thing, right?
Yeah.
If the people who've stuck with us this long, they've stuck with us for 40 minutes through a pretty technical conversation. I think this is quite the payoff, and I think anyone can understand this. So talk about the mask mandates and the different kind of variables they have and what you found.
Um, Yeah, let me just add one thing before I get to the really juicy part, because it's also important. One thing I did is that I didn't just look at different specifications of the model. It's what happened though is that between the time they submitted their paper and the time it was published, the data for both cases and deaths were revised, and when you use the revised data where various errors have been fixed, etc., then it's even worse. Then in that case, the most of the time the effect of mask, it becomes significant less than half of the time. In fact, when you use the latest version of the data set, it's almost never significant. So it completely changes the picture, just because the data that they've used have changed, since they've undergone revisions since they submitted the paper, and now if it makes their own analysis completely outdated, because when you use more recent version of the data, even the effect of mandating mask for employees in public facing businesses completely goes away. It's not even that we're not talking here about it's only significant in 78% of cases. No, it's just like it almost never is. Uh, so that's another big thing. Where in this case it's just the data have changed, and the peer review process and the journal's editorial process is very long. And between the time the paper was submitted and the time it was published, their main result was completely obsolete. Because if you had done the same analysis as I did using up to date data, the effect is no longer there. That's one thing. And then I'm going to get to the really juicy part, which is the one that you were alluding to. So one thing that's really surprising, I alluded to it too earlier, is that they didn't look at the effect of mandating masks for everyone. They looked at the effect of mandating masks for employees of public-facing businesses. So we're talking about like a tiny fraction of the population, and a tiny fraction of all human interactions that happen every day. So again, it's like only employees in public-facing businesses, and they find that this has a very large effect, which, as I said before, isn't really plausible, and it's even less plausible when you look at the detail. Because remember that I said that one of the nice things about their model is that it allows you to distinguish between the effect of voluntary behavior changes and the effect of policy. But another nice thing is that for the effect of policy, it allows you to distinguish between the direct effect of policy. So in the case of the mask mandate, the direct effect of policy is that when employees put a mask in front of their mouth, it blocks the virus particles and prevents them from infecting other people. That's the direct effect. But then this policy and other policies, they could also have an indirect effect, which is that it's possible that, for instance, when people see employees start wearing masks, in businesses, it makes them scared. They're like, "Oh, this thing is serious." If employees are mandating to wear a mask, this is some serious stuff, and so they change their behavior. It's like, okay, maybe I'm not going to throw this party tonight with my friends, right? Because That doesn't look like a great idea if you see all this stuff going on. And so this is an indirect effect of policy. And when you look at their results, it's not just that they find a very large effect of mandating masks for employees in public facing businesses, which, as I noted before, doesn't really pass a basic smell test, but it's also that they find that this effect is entirely driven by the direct effect. So, this is even less plausible. I mean, come on, who seriously believes? Even I do think that masks work, to some extent. I think that they do, that if someone puts a mask in front of their mouth, they're making it less likely that they're going to infect other people and less likely that they're going to be infected if they're exposed to someone who has been infected. But, again, we're talking about a tiny number of people here, only employees in public facing businesses, who are only involved in like a tiny fraction of the human interaction that happen every day. So how large could the direct effect is? To the extent that this policy has any effect, we'd expect that it would be mostly indirect. That is, that the mechanism would be the one I just described, where people start seeing employees wearing masks and they get scared and they change their behaviors in other ways. And this has a large effect on transmission. But if you look at their results, they say, no, it had a very large effect, and the effect was entirely due to the direct effect. And this really isn't plausible. But what makes it particularly implausible is that we're just talking about employees of public-facing businesses. And so when I saw this, I was like, this is really weird. I mean, there wasn't, as far as I can tell, there wasn't any controversies about this kind of mandate, which makes sense. They only concern a tiny number of people. And I was like, why didn't they look at mandates that mandating masks for everyone in public spaces, not just employees of public-facing businesses, but everyone. If you're in a public space, you have to wear a mask. Those are the kind of mask mandates that people have been focusing on. About which there's been a lot of debate, etc. And so I thought that was weird. And what I found out when I was digging into their code and the data they used, I found out that actually they had a variable coding for this policy, for this kind of much broader mass mandate. And I was like, oh, that's weird, and like, so what I did is that I did the same analysis they did, but instead of using the variable for the mandates that was only for employees of public-facing businesses, I used the variable that was for mandating masks for everyone. And when I do this, I find that there is no effect. At least there is no statistically significant.
Yeah.
So they're saying, just mandating employees of public-facing business to wear a mask, while they're at work, this has a very large effect and is statistically significant. It reduces both cases and death. But then when I do the same analysis using a much broader mandate that we'd expect to have, I mean, if the first mandate has an effect, this one should be much larger, right? I mean, it's just basic common sense. And then when I do the same analysis on this much broader policy, I find no effect. And it kind of totally undermines even their results about the mandate that only targets employees of public-facing businesses. I mean, it makes no sense. Like, this mandate is not going to have a very large effect if the much broader mandate that involves everyone doesn't have any statistically significant effect. In fact, it's not just that the result is not statistically significant, it's also that the point estimate of the effect, their estimation of the effect is smaller than for the other mandate. I mean, it's just, none of this makes any sense. And what's extraordinary is that they didn't do this in the paper. They just totally ignored this variable, which when most of the controversy about masks has been about those kind of mandates, universal mandates. Nobody cares what employees of public-facing business are they're forced to wear a mask. That's not what people are fighting about. And so this is pretty surprising. What's even more surprising that at some point in the paper there's a footnote where they do note this. They note, by the way, let's be clear, we're only evaluating the effect of mandating masks for employees of public facing businesses. We're not evaluating the effect of mandating masks for everyone in public spaces. And then they go on to speculate based on some other papers and some quick and dirty calculation that the effect could be like an order of magnitude larger of this other policy. But I mean, come on, you had the data to check, and when you do, there is no effect, or at least no statistically significant effect, and even the point estimate is smaller. So I mean, come on, it's just like it's just very bad, And I mean, I talked to one of the authors, right? I emailed them, and one of them, Paul Shrimps, replied to me. So um, I mean, at least he was very responsive, so I can't criticize him for this. And what he explained to me, he explained something that makes sense. To be completely fair, that part of it makes sense. He explained that this is a decision they made early when they started working on the paper, because at the time there was more states that had there was few states who had mandated masks for everyone, and there was like more states who had done so for employees in public facing businesses. And even by the end of the period, there was like more than twice as many states who had mandating masks for employees in public facing businesses than states that had mandating masks for everyone in public spaces. And so, given that this is the case, you expect that the effect is going to be harder to detect. Yeah, well, you expect that it's going to be harder to detect, other things being equal, but we don't expect other things being equal, because we expect that the effect of the universal mandate is going to be much larger. So even if it's present in less states, it should still be probably easier to detect than the other one, at least as easy, I would say. I mean, we have no way to know for sure. But my point is that I don't think that's a really good reason. I don't think, by the way, for the record, I don't think Paul Shrimps disagrees with this, because he did concede in his reply that by the time they were done by the paper, it would have made sense to use this variable instead of the other one, or in addition to the other one. So I don't think even them would deny this. That really, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, if you do this, if you look at it, then the 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 effect disappears, and I think this completely undermines the whole their headline conclusion, which again was about this mandate on employees in public-facing businesses. They have another paper. He told me also when I emailed him, he told him they have another paper where they use data at the county level, and it's not focused on mask; it focused on schools.
Yeah.
But they use the different data set on mask, and apparently they do find an effect that's for the universal mask mandate that's consistent with what they found in this paper. But it's I haven't been able, like, the code is not available. The paper hasn't been published yet, hasn't been accepted for publication. The paper, there's a preprint. And I expect that if I did the same thing, like looking at different specifications, exactly the
Yeah.
same thing would happen. And anyway, as we'll discuss soon, the entire framework is probably deeply flawed anyway. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean,
I
we
mean,
shouldn't even.
it's just bad to that. I think one thing I do blame them a lot for is they could have looked at at universal mandates in this paper, and not only did they not, but they even speculated that it might be very large when they had the data to just check, and it takes 5 minutes to do. So I mean, in fact, honestly, I have a hard time believing they haven't done so. But whatever.
Yeah. I mean, even if you find a result, like, setting aside all this stuff, I mean, even if you find a result, you still haven't done the cost benefit to say if it's worth it, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
have,
absolutely. That's a different question. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, there's just so much that's wrong here. I think it's worth. Yeah, I think people can check out the post if they're interested. It's very technical, but you'll learn something. I mean, the point is, like, so what you're doing here is you're not just taking apart one paper for the sake of taking apart one paper, right? There's a broader lesson. So if you just say, who cares about this one paper I never heard of, why would I go look at this takedown of this paper, which I don't think is that important? What would you say to somebody who says that? Because the justification for looking at how terribly things can go, there's a broader lesson here, right?
Yes. There's a broader lesson to what we've already discussed, because um, the problem, that often results are sensitive to semi-arbitrary assumptions that are made by the authors of the paper. This is not limited to this paper. This is ubiquitous, and it's very, very important that people understand that, because they have to understand that whenever you try to study a question like this, or it doesn't even have to be about the pandemic. This is again ubiquitous. You do statistical analysis of anything. You're gonna have to make like dozens or even hundreds of decisions at different steps of the process. And those decisions, very often, it's not as if there's going to be a right decision. There's not going to be an objectively right decision to make. At various steps, there are different choices you could make, different choices, and they're equally reasonable. Given your background knowledge, you have no way to say that one choice would be superior to the other. But by making the right, and I'm putting right in scare quotes here, choices, trying different possibility, you can ensure that you get the results you want. Or even, if you don't do it on purpose, you may find results that are one thing, but if you had made different but equally reasonable choices at various steps of the process, you would have found completely different results. And so this is very important to understand, because it means that unless you take steps to make sure that um, you are not just looking at a handful of possible and equally plausible specification, but you're actually looking at the whole range of them, or at least enough of them, you can't really be confident that your conclusions are correct. And this would also be true, by the way, if they had found that the interventions had no effect, or even that they had that they actually made things worse. I would have said the same thing in regard to this. Uh, this is a very important lesson. And yeah, sure, you may not care about this particular paper, but I think what I think is important, the reason why I wrote this piece, is that if you want people to really understand how dramatic the consequences of this fact, the fact that whenever you do statistical analysis, you have to make all those choices, and they're semi-arbitrary, and you end up with lots of different possibilities, and that can affect the result of lot. You have to look. There is no way of convincing yourself of that, of how much it matters, than by looking at a case study and looking very concretely in a specific case how those seemingly innocent choices that are clearly semi-arbitrary can end up, when you compound them, end up making like huge differences, and different. That means that different people looking at the same data with the same empirical strategy could 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 find like completely different conclusions, and you couldn't say that one of them did something very wrong and not the other. It's just that they made different choices, different but equally reasonable choices at different steps of the process. And because those different choices compounded, in the end, they ended up finding reaching completely different conclusions. And I think this is a very important lesson. And, uh, this is not about this is not a case of being like hyper skeptical. Again, this is not that. It's an objective fact. It's not. I'm not exaggerating when I say that those choices, although different and leading to different conclusions, they're equally reasonable based on your background knowledge. You can't really say that one is better than the other. And so, if your results are sensitive to this, um, to those choices, then you can't really be confident in your results. Because you have no reason to prefer one specification to any of the others that are equally plausible based on your background knowledge. So this is a very important lesson. It's more like a matter of epistemology. So it's more my thing, as in like originally a philosopher of science. Um, it's you you have you're not in a position when this is the case to be confident in any of the particular. The only way you're going to be able to be confident in your conclusions is if you look at all of the equally plausible specification you get by making all of the possible choices. I mean, you can never look at all of the possible choices because there are infinitely many, but you can look at a broad enough range. If you do this and you find that it doesn't affect your conclusion stays the same qualitatively. Of course, quantitatively it's never going to be exactly the same in different specification. But if it stays the same qualitatively, That is, if you find in all cases in this example, for instance, if you had found that in all cases, no matter what specification you use, such and such a policy reduced roughly by that much the number of cases, the number of the growth rate in cases, the growth rate of death, then you could have been confident in the conclusion. But you can't if that's not the case. And in beyond this study, this is ubiquitous. There in the vast majority of studies on any topic, again, it's not just the pandemic. You're gonna have the those arbitrary decisions that you make. They're gonna change potentially. They can completely change the conclusion you reach in the end, and so it's very important to understand this.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, I mean and what you said about you can look at the same data and you can find completely different results. So what happens in practicality, right? What gets ends up getting published? How do people cut the data? They end up finding the political results that they want, right? They find the thing that accords with their ideology, right? So if you are, you want, you are for whatever reason more inclined to COVID lockdowns, to non-pharmaceutical interventions, and the data is sort of it can tell you what you want to hear. And there's eight out of 10 say academics want more lockdowns. That's what they want to find. They're going to find that 8 out of 10 times, not even taking into account the file drawer effect, right? The fact that results that actually find something are more likely to get published than results that don't find something. And so this is why science.
You have to find the right. I mean, look, those people they have careers. You want to publish or perish. You have to publish if you want to have a career in academia. If you want to get rewards, fellowships, nice jobs, etc. You want to publish in good journals. And if you say, as you say, if you say that the vast majority of scholars in your field are biased in favor of lockdowns, not even necessarily consciously, but even unconsciously, you're gonna have strong incentives to make the choices. When you make all those semi-arbitrary choices, you're gonna have strong incentives to even convince yourself that those purely arbitrary choices that you made were actually the reasonable ones. And it just happens to be that those are the choices that allow you to find that lockdowns are really effective. But if you want to get published, if you want to have a good career, the incentives are really for you to do this. And again, I'm not even saying that they're dishonest. I think often to the extent that they lie to themselves more often than not. But this we're using the example of lockdowns here, but that's the same for everything. I mean, if you're an economist and you do a paper, on whether immigration has an effect on wage, for instance, on the wages of natives, uh, I can guarantee you that it's easier for you. You're going to make your life easier if you find that it doesn't, or even that it increases the wages of natives. Whatever, you can find it. You can find hundreds of examples. Just like first one that came to mind. My point is that uh, given that on the one hand you have very strong incentives to publish certain kinds of results, and as you said in the first place, you have to incentives to publish results. Like if you find there is no effect already, even if it's true, it's less likely that you'll get published. But even as you say, if you put that aside, you have strong incentives to find some certain effects. And then there's also the situation where at each step of the process, when you're putting together your model, you have to make lots of, or even preparing the data, because it's not just about the model itself, it's even worse than that. It's even how you prepare the data exactly, you have lots of choices involved in there. But at each step of the process, you have to make various choices. And, objectively, given your background knowledge, there is not one that's uh, indisputably superior to the others. So you have lots of possibilities. Andrew Gell-Mann is a statistician. He calls that the garden of fork and path. Okay, you have all those possibilities at each step. You have a fork and path. You can take right or you can take left, and you don't really have, like in the sort of cases that I find most interesting, you don't really have, given your background knowledge, a clear reason to prefer right to left or left to right. Uh, But if you add to this the fact, so this means that you can get very different specification that may get you very different results. If you have incentives to find certain results, then it creates the risk that you're going to make those choices that happen to lead you to the right, again in scare quotes, conclusions, which are the ones that are maximizing the chance that you're going to get published in a good journal, that your colleagues are going to talk about and talk in a good way about your papers and promote it, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, and near the end of the paper, I mean, you say something. You write, even without looking at the detail of a study, you should be very suspicious of any claim based on sophisticated statistical techniques that can't already be made plausible by just showing the data in a simple chart. So, what you're saying here is pretty profound. So, you learn statistics, and we use statistics for different reasons, and what it sounds like you're saying is there is some basic statistics, right? You know what hypothesis testing is. You know how to read a regression table. You can read a graph and figures, and you can tell what's going on. There's that level of statistical literacy, right? And then, but if you're a professor of statistics, or even a professor of economics or political science or some field that uses statistics, to justify sort of your job, you have to use something more sophisticated. You can't just do something that any blogger could do, right? Any blogger with basic intelligence and some basic statistical training and ability to think reasonably is so is I guess what I want to know is the whole sort of the idea of sophisticated statistics, right? Beyond, I mean, and when I mean sophisticated, I mean the highest level, not like the first few courses you take in graduate school, but like the stuff the highest level PhD economists, professors at elite institutions, the stuff that they're doing. Is that stuff just worthless? Does it have any value at all? Is it just obfuscation and hiding for studies that are poorly done like this, or do you think there's any way to redeem these things?
I think there is some value, but I think the value is mainly the real value, in my opinion, is mainly that those techniques allow you to become more confident in something that you were already pretty sure was true. So in this case, I think yes, that can be useful. But to go back to the passage of my blog post that you just quoted, um, this is the key thing. Like, look, what you really have to understand, because for most people, those statistical techniques are kind of voodoo magic. Um, what you really have to understand is that those statistical techniques, they always make pretty strong assumptions, and those assumptions, they are not derived from the data. Basically, you have to make a bet that those assumptions are true. And sometimes you have good reasons to think they are, but very often you have no clue. So you're making a bet. And the point is that those very complicated, sophisticated statistical techniques, they will allow you to answer the question you're asking only on the assumptions that those things are true. And very often you're not really in a position to know they're true. So what I'm saying is that because in fact, I'm making a stronger claim. Like if you can't make, you use this complicated statistical technique and you find a certain result. And my point is, if you can't make this result, this conclusion plausible by just showing the data in a simple chart, if the authors can't do that, then you shouldn't be confident in the result. You should take it always with a huge grain of salt and regard it with the utmost suspicion, because in almost all cases, you have far more reason to trust what you can see on a simple chart that just shows the data than you have reason to trust that those assumptions that are on which those statistical techniques rest to deliver accurate results are actually true. So, in my opinion, I'm not saying those techniques have no value. I do think they have some value, but I think their value is much more modest than people assume. Their value is basically, okay, if I have this causal story. I have this story about like this. Say, for instance, this policy has such and such effect. Okay, and say that I can show you. I can just show the data on a graph on a simple chart. And when you look at this simple chart where there was no fancy statistics involved, no complex transformation of the data, etc., etc., you look at this chart and you're like, yeah, okay, you know what? Your causal story, it kind of makes sense. I can see it on the chart. if you see it on the chart, then you're in a position where you're like, okay, yeah, I can sort of buy this story. And then the value of those complicated statistical techniques, in my opinion, is that when you're in this situation, if in addition, when you're using those complicated statistical tools, and they find the same conclusion on what you can already see on this simple chart, then it should raise your credence, your confidence that this conclusion is indeed true. So it's not as if it had no value whatsoever, but I think the value is much more modest than most people who promote this kind of statistics would think. Because in many cases, it's simply not the case that you can make the story, the conclusion of your complicated statistics plausible with a simple chart. When
Yeah.
that's not the case, in some cases we have good reasons to think that the assumptions on which those techniques rest are true. So in those cases, that's another case where they have value, because if you have good reasons to think that the assumptions on which they rely are actually true, then okay, then you can kind of trust the conclusion. But again, I don't think this is the majority of cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're saying is sort of the opposite of, the incentive structure in academia. What you're saying that the fancy stuff is the least valuable kind of work. And in academia, it's the most valuable. I had a professor who was teaching a graduate course in statistics once who said, this, you have to do this fancy stuff. This is what sells. What doesn't sell is truth. Nobody cares about that. If you're a guy who goes and just finds, charts that put them together and you put them together and you explain the world, you can't publish that as an academic paper. Nobody cares. I mean, I think about my maybe the article that got most attention of anything I ever written is Why Everything is Liberal, right? And
Yeah,
there's no fancy statistics, there's no nothing. I think that I found something very important. I used some basic statistics and track down some data, not really statistics, just presenting data that other people have done, and I think it said something important and people found it fascinating. That couldn't get into any academic journal just because it's not fancy enough, right?
yeah, yeah,
And this is just such a huge problem. The academic work has the prestige, and like bloggers and people who do Twitter threads and people who have Substacks, do not have the prestige. But just because something is the most complicated way to do something doesn't mean it's the best way to do something. And that's the way academia thinks, and it's absolutely terrible, is it not?
yeah. No, I think it's a deep and very important point. There is really like the incentives in academia are cross purposes with what we like to think of as the goal of academia, at least what we think should be the goal of science, which is getting at the truth. And I think this is true. You want to. I mean, the two are not necessarily incompatible, but in practice, like I said, it's because you could conceivably write a paper, and those papers exist. I've read some where people start by presenting the data in a simple chart, and they say, okay, look, it looks like this is already making my conclusion plausible, and then they go on to use like fancy statistics to make the claim more believable, and this is perfectly fine. But um, very often that's not what happens. Like you said, there are strong incentives to use fancy statistics, and it doesn't. People know, those people are, at least most of the top researchers, they know that those statistical techniques, they're only reliable if their assumptions are true, and that often we don't really know if they're true. They're aware of this, uh, but it doesn't, most of the times it doesn't really matter. Like they what matters is like the performance. It's kind of, there's in many ways academia is like kabuki theater. You go through the motions, and you have a certain script that you have to follow, and if you follow the script, the right script, you're going to get published and your career is going to move forward. But that script is not really truth conducive. That's not really what we'd hope that institutions of scientific institutions and academic institutions will be set up in such a way that they're truth conducive. But that's I don't think that's really the case. I mean, they are minimally so. I don't want to say we have.
Yeah.
It depends on the field. I think there are some fields where it's literally not even a little bit truth conducive. But I don't think it's the case of all fields. There are some where it's somewhat truth conducive, but not nearly as much as it should and as it could, because those incentives get in the way. The incentives are cross purposes with this goal of getting at the truth, and uh, this taste for like fancy, sophisticated statistics. Uh, that's definitely a part of it. It's hardly the only thing, but like it's definitely a part of it. And you're right that in this respect, what I was saying about how first thing you should do is like convince me of your conclusion with a simple chart, and if you can't do that, I'm not really going to buy uh, your fancy statistical analysis unless I have excellent reasons to think that the assumptions on which it's based are true, but that's almost never the case. This is not how it works.
Yeah, it's worth thinking a little bit about just dwelling on the incentive structure a little bit. So I don't want to pick on Chernozhukov, or if that's how you pronounce his name, but I think he's a very successful professor. So I think if you're going to pick on anybody, I mean, I don't feel bad about
No, I
pointing
mean,
to him.
it's widely considered a future Nobel Prize in economics. So
Okay,
I think you'll be okay.
yeah. Okay. Well, all right. Well, so and nothing. Well, no, I don't think he's doing anything that's special as far as anything that's much of an outlier for all these problems. But I'm looking at his Google Scholar page. Right. He's a professor, Department of Economics, Center for Statistics and Data Science at MIT. He's got 10 publications. All of them have one or two or three co-authors, as far as I can tell. 10 publications in 2021. So it's been about 7 months of the year. So he's got a publication. He's got a publication a month. I assume that each one is about as complex as this is, or maybe close to it. I haven't checked, but let's say at least a few of them are. And this is the incentive. The incentive is not to do what you do, right? The incentive is not to put together, to just really, really drill down into something, establish some kind of epistemological certainty about sort of the range of the effects that you're looking at, right? Which is what you're doing. The incentive is to do it sloppily, make your assumptions, get it out there, get it published, and then move on to the next thing. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't care. I don't know if he really cares about masks or K-12s. K-12 closers. He could. Maybe he doesn't care less at all. That it couldn't care less at all. That that's not really. That's not really necessary to explain what's going on here. It's just the incentive is going to. The incentives are such in a way that they are going to reward people who do a lot of sloppy work. People who do little, people who do thorough work, and it takes time and effort to do thorough work, right? I don't think you can do work that's really thorough and you're publishing, one paper every 3 weeks, one paper every month. Sometimes I see these. It's really bad seams in medicine and psychology. I'll see people who have like 10 co-authored, 10 co-authors on like each paper, and every 2 weeks or every month they're releasing something, and who to like take apart like a scholar's career, you would have to spend as much time on it as they do, right? You'd have to become a full-time scholar yourself just to fact check, sort of
You'd have to spend more time.
Oh yeah, yeah. You probably spent more time on this than a Chernobyl. Do you have any doubt about that? That you spent more on this time on this paper than?
I mean, there were three of them, so I'm sure that if only because of this, I spend more time. I can see. I think they started working on it in April 2020, and they submitted it. So they spent about like maybe 2 months and a half, 3 months top on this. But there were three of them, and then they did some, they had some revisions before the paper was. You can see all that because they have put the code on GitHub, and I've looked into this, because there was also a bug in the there was a bug in the code that they used for the paper. So at first I was surprised because like I couldn't reproduce their results, but then I changed with Paul Schrems, and he realized that there was a bug in their original code that had been fixed.
I guess what I'm wondering is, can you become a successful academic at Chernozhokov's level without doing a lot of sloppy work? Like, is that possible? Like, so I think Gelman, I don't know a lot about, I know his blog, but I think what he does is just debunk stuff mostly. I don't know if he makes claims himself, but he does a lot of debunking. So maybe you can get at at a high level just by debunking things. But if you're making positive claims about things that are true, and you're publishing enough papers to become a professor at MIT or a similar university, can you just assume that that kind of person is just doing a lot of sloppy work, or would you not go that far?
I wouldn't necessarily go that far because even Chernovchukov, I'm sorry, I also probably don't mispronounce his name, but sorry, whatever. Um, I don't hold it against people if they can't pronounce mine, so I'm hoping that they will do the same with me. Based on what I know about him, like I mean, he's not for what my understanding is that he's not known for applied work. That's one thing. He's I think his main contribution have been theoretical, or like in the field of econometrics. It's basically I think he's more of a guy who creates tools, statistical tools for other people to use in applied works. So I think it's probably like my understanding is done some very good work in that area, but I'm not really in a position to judge. I mean, I haven't read like all of his work, or in fact, I haven't read any of his work except for this one paper. Um, but I think it's true. Look, I want one thing I want to say because I think you're right that anyone who's successful in almost any academic fields and has published a lot of positive results, um, has published a lot of false things, not just a lot of false things, but also a lot of things which are not just false, but also if they had done the kind of, say, sensitivity analysis in a more systematic manner, they would have seen that it was, if not false, at least that they couldn't assert that it was true. But of course, then they wouldn't have gotten published. Uh,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I think this is true, but I think it's not. I mean, there is a lot of dishonesty. I don't want to get people off the hook. I mean, they can look the stuff about the. I'm gonna be honest, like the stuff about the mask, thing. Like I'm pretty sure this is p hacking. This is like the news is. But I can't be sure. Maybe I'm just being unfair with them. Like I'm not. I have no way to prove it. But whatever. If not in this case, certainly I know for a fact that this happens actually pretty often. This kind of like p hacking, which is where people know what they're doing. Um, so that's one thing. But I think what happens even more often is that people do, in fact, work that is in fact, sloppy in the sense, when I say sloppy, like again, this paper, for instance, in many ways, it's not sloppy in the sense that it's very sophisticated. They actually thought through carefully about the various causal processes here. They did this causal schema at the beginning to they motivated their model with like an epidemiological model. They did in some, there's a sense in which it's clearly not sloppy. In fact, the reason why I chose this paper is precisely because it was not sloppy in that sense.
Well, it was
But there is
sloppy
another
in the
sense.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, go ahead. I
Yeah,
think you're
there
going to
is
say what I
another
was saying.
sense in which it definitely is sloppy. Because they didn't, account for the all of those different choices, semi-arbitrary choices they had to make, that I was talking about earlier, and they didn't take this seriously enough to present a fuller array of results that would have shown that their results are extremely sensitive to those assumptions, semi-arbitrary assumptions you make, or when you set up your model. And I think this is ubiquitous. Like I say, I think this is definitely everywhere. But I think it's not just, of course. I mean, you're right. Like the incentives are play a huge role. I think it's also because they don't think most scientists don't think carefully enough about those epistemological questions. Because really, this is a matter of epistemology, and I'm not saying they can't understand it or that they never understand it. What do they do? I read like people like Gelman, they talk about that sort of things. And many other people talk about that sort of things who are not philosophers of science, they're actual scientists. But it's we there is not that much difference between a scientist and a craftsman, in the sense that just like a craftsman is an apprentice and he learns to do certain things. There is like this way of making of like fixing, plumbing, and you have certain techniques that you learn, and then you go through the motions, and you have slightly different situation that you face, but then you always apply the same script, follow the same script basically. And I think it's basically the same for scientists. And because of the way they're trained, because they're trained like this, they're trained basically like plumbers. No offense to plumbers, this. In the case of plumbers, there's nothing wrong with this. In the case of scientists, I think it's more problematic. But basically, they are trained this way. They're trained to follow a script, and so they're going to take different questions and they're going to follow the same script mechanically. I think that more often than not, they don't really think about those things. They don't think about how much those semi-arbitrary assumptions, are in fact semi-arbitrary, and how sensitive to those assumptions their conclusions are. Because, again, they weren't trained like this, and as you were saying, they have no incentives to do this. Like the incentives is to not do this. But I'm just saying it's not just about the incentives. It's also that, again, we greatly exaggerate, in my opinion, the difference between craftsmen and scientists are just craftsmen of sorts, and this that's part of the explanation for this kind of problems.
Yeah, I think I think the plumber comparison I think is unfair to plumbers and craftsmen. I mean, if you're a plumber, you have to right. If you have a technique of whatever unclogging pipes and it doesn't work, you're going to find out pretty quickly. If you're a scientist or if you're an academic publishing papers and you're churning out result after result after result and none of them are true, you have no feedback on that unless somebody like you
But
comes along.
that's just because my point. I agree with this. I'm not saying they're similar in all respects. I'm saying they're similar. They're very similar, much more than people realize. In this respect, that they learn a certain set of techniques. They learn to follow a certain limited number of scripts, and then in their career they just follow these scripts, pretty mechanically, and that's how they churn out papers, and this is how you get successful academics. Uh, you know, I'm not saying, of course, I'm not saying they're, and I agree it's unfair, with plumbers. Although you could say that at least the plumbers is lucky enough that he's gonna get the feedback. He's gonna, if his fix like doesn't work, he's gonna know it pretty soon, and he'll have to fix it. I guess in a way, you could defend scientists and say, well, they don't know this, so they don't even. Perhaps probably the plumber would mess things up just as much if they didn't have this feedback. But of course, it's kind of like it's difficult to even imagine what it would be like for a plumber not to have the feedback. But my point is, again, not that they're similar in all respects, of course, or in particular, I agree they're not similar in this respect that you were talking about. But my point is they're similar, at least in this respect, that their training is basically learning a certain number of scripts, and then for the rest of their career, they're going to mostly follow those scripts, and that's how you get to be a successful academic. And the problem is that following those scripts isn't conducive to finding true stuff, or at least stuff that we can be confident is true.
Yeah, you're saying what would a plumber, be like without feedback? I imagine, like, I don't know if you ever, you call a plumber sometimes and they try to explain to you the problem, that you're having, and it would be sort of like, if they were like academics, it would be sort of like he just like listened to you on the phone about the problem, and then the plumber said, do X, Y, and Z, right, without ever looking or touching, the wherever you're having the problem, and then not even being told after you're done whether he was right or wrong, right? He just gives you the advice and he hangs up the phone.
It's as if your house like instantly disappeared immediately after you've dealt with the plumber, so you'll never have any way of knowing if it actually worked or something.
Yeah, somebody. As I've looked more into this stuff and I've become more skeptical of academia, these statistical methods. Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I used to think he was a little bit too extreme. He goes out there and just says it's all nonsense. You shouldn't trust any scientist, any publication, anything. And as time has gone on, I think that's that's closer to the truth than the trust the experts, than people who are just amazed by publications and equations and figures.
It's definitely not true, and I wouldn't say that, but you're totally right that it's most certainly closer to the truth than the prevailing narrative about science. That's not hard. I mean, the prevailing narrative about science is pretty terrible.
Yeah, and Talib blocked me for the funniest reason ever on Twitter, and I think the only person who blocked me on Twitter who I became sad about. I said, "Oh, this is an actually insightful person." So if you're
Yeah,
listening, if you're
it's
listening,
funny, he follows me, and he's I think he's the only person who follows me who I know will never just stop following me. If at some point
he's gonna be.
he's sufficiently annoyed with me, which I know he already is, but not yet enough that he wants to block me. But if I know that the moment he consider that like I'm no longer interesting enough or whatever, he's not gonna just unfollow me. He's going to block me and be really angry about it. And I think it's pretty funny, but I'm very confident of this. So I think that's pretty funny because there's no one else on Twitter I can say that about. Like everyone else, I know that at some point I'm just gonna annoy them. They're just gonna quietly unfollow me. But with Taleb, I know I'll know it immediately.
We were mutuals until one day I posted a joke that Scott Alexander made in his blog about Talib, and then he says, "How dare you post this?" or something like that. And he blocked me, and that's the end of our relationship. So
Yeah,
Talib, please,
maybe he'll
unblock me
unblock
if you're
you
listening.
eventually. Like I've seen this happen to some people.
Yeah, we could hope. Anyways, this was fun, Philippe. I mean, I think this post lives up to your war on science billing. You might want to call the blog war on statistics, but I guess statistics is part of sort of the umbrella of what people think science is, and it's a fascinating work, and I look forward to seeing you along with CSPI, develop these ideas further, the problems with academia, the problems with official science, and how we can hopefully do better. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's the plan. Thanks. It was great.